the most worrying of which were the then powerful Cathars, or as they were sometimes known, Albigensians, who were deeply embedded in the culture of southern France and northern Italy. These profoundly pessimistic dualists taught that matter and the material world, including the human body, were sinful, something from which to escape. And as a consequence, they rejected both the incarnation and the resurrection, and indeed the whole sacramental system of Catholicism, which is, of course, itself incarnational. St. Francis and St. Thomas, in their different but closely related ways, resisted these gloomy teachings. As is well known, Aquinas affirmed the intrinsic goodness of the material creation. More poetically, and often dramatically, Francis expressed his love of creation by describing all existing things as a network of sibling relationships, a family created by God. For him, everything was our brother or our sister. Even sister death was part of the family that is creation. And in articulating these views so powerfully, so cogently, both saints saved Christianity from that false spiritualization of Christian faith into which these heresies would have led it. But there's also a problem with the adjective Franciscan. While it makes sense to look to the orders that Benedict, Dominic, and Ignatius founded in order to discover the Benedictine, Dominican, or Jesuit spirituality, Franciscan spirituality is the spirituality of the founder, not the order. Just as it's often said that there was only ever one Christian, namely Christ himself, so it's also often said that there was only ever one Franciscan, St. Francis himself. And unlike the other orders, the Franciscan order wasn't founded for a specific purpose. I knew a Franciscan a long time ago, Father Hilary MacDonough from Galway, who, when he was asked what the Franciscans were founded for, would say that the Benedictines were founded to pray, the Dominicans were founded to preach, the Jesuits were founded to teach, but the Franciscans were founded to love everybody and everything. Even in the early days of the order, it used to be said that if you wanted to know about knowledge, you should consult a Dominican. But if you wanted to know about love, you should ask a Franciscan. So if it makes sense at all to speak of Franciscan spirituality, it can only mean the spirit of St. Francis himself. And that's what I think we should direct our attention to this evening. But immediately we encounter another problem. Given the unique and extraordinary personal charisma of St. Francis, his spirit has always been controversial and always from the very beginning subject to widely differing interpretation. Even during his own lifetime, the brethren disagreed among themselves, sometimes violently, about the spirit of St. Francis. And inevitably, after his death, these disagreements would lead the order to splinter and fragment into many different branches. Even now, there are still 3 main branches to the so-called First Order, that is, the Orders of Friars. But that itself was the result of an attempt in the 19th century by Pope Leo XIII to curb the chaos of a huge number of different groups, all of them disagreeing among themselves, the so-called Leonine Union. But the problems faced by the order after St. Francis's death are a perfect example of how difficult it is, if not impossible, to institutionalize charisma. The spirit of St. Francis is impossible to institutionalize, or to put that more colloquially, it simply can't be canned. But at this distance from his life, where should we turn to find the elusive spirit of St. Francis? It's not even easy at this remove to construct an uncontroversial historical account of his life. The quest for the historical Francis, the so-called Franciscan question, is even now as problematic as the quest for the historical Jesus was in the 19th century. Even shortly after his death, when his contemporaries were still living, disputes arose about the accuracy or acceptability of some of the accounts of his life that had been penned. Such was the degree of disagreement, the Paris chapter in 1266 decreed that there was to be only one official account, namely that written by the Minister General of the Order, the great theologian Saint Bonaventure, who came to be known as the order's second founder. All other accounts were to be destroyed. With characteristic obedience, the brethren, of course, ignored that particular instruction. So the answer to the question of where the spirit of St. Francis is to be found must be in his own writings, specifically his personal writings, and even more specifically in his prayers. We're fortunate that no age has had better access to his writings than the present, thanks to the painstaking work of Franciscan scholars over the last century. Now, Francis had written a very brief rule of life, now lost, for presentation to Pope Innocent III in 1209, when he travelled south to Rome to seek papal approval for his still small group of followers. It's thought that it consisted simply of a series of scriptural quotations. The other two rules that he wrote or co-wrote are much longer, but it's significant that the very first words of even the much later officially accepted rule of 1223 state with stark simplicity this: "This is the rule and life of the Friars Minor, namely, to observe the holy gospel of our Lord Jesus Christ by living in obedience, without anything of their own, and in chastity." Of course, it's unlikely at this very early stage, 1209, that Francis had any notion of founding an order as such. It's also undoubtedly true that even if he had, he was totally unsuited to the task, just as he was unsuited to lead an order, which is why he handed over the reins as soon as he could to Brother Elias of Cortona. The order as such happened spontaneously, simply because others, including St. Clare, about whom more later, were attracted to his way of life. The fact that in due course a structured community emerged was in the historical context both a practical and canonical necessity, given the fact that so many joined him so rapidly. The growth rates were truly phenomenal. Within a few years, there were literally thousands of Franciscans across the whole of Europe and beyond. They were sent to England by Francis himself 2 years before his death, arriving in Dover on the 10th of September, 1224. It's worth stressing at this point that contrary to a widely popular image of St. Francis, he was not anti the institutional church. His anxiety to do nothing without papal approval points to a vital aspect of St. Francis's mindset. In his earlier rule, he says, "Let all the brothers be, live, and speak as Catholics." And he frequently exhorted the brethren to live more catholico, in a Catholic manner. By going to see Pope Innocent III, he wanted consciously to distance himself from the various heretical movements, many of them orders of penance similar to his own small group. And again, in the first chapter of the Rule of 1223, the official chapter, he states unequivocally, "Brother Francis promises obedience and reverence to Pope Honorius III and his canonically elected successors, and to the Roman Church." The idea that Francis was an anti-institutional hippie, as depicted in Rossellini's 1950 film, or more recently in 1972, but with much less merit, in Zeffirelli's Brother Sun and Sister Moon, has proven remarkably tenacious, despite its having no foundation in fact. As has the view that Francis was a rebellious forerunner of the Protestant Reformation, first articulated by the French Calvinist scholar Paul Sabatier in his influential, if flawed, biography published in 1894. In all Francis's writings, there is not a hint of criticism ever directed towards the church, the papacy, or the hierarchy. On the contrary, from the very beginning, he aligned all that he did and said within the hierarchical boundaries of the church. Nor was he in the least anti-clerical, as has often been alleged. Nothing could be further from the truth. He himself was an ordained deacon, and though he consciously chose not to be a priest, and even discouraged the brethren from doing so, though many who were already priests joined him, he explicitly revered the priesthood and priests as such, even the most unworthy among them, because of what they did, principally because it was they who celebrated the Mass, but also because of what they were by ordination, namely, according to the teaching of Lateran IV, themselves sacraments of Christ. He even revered the physical church buildings because of what took place within them. And while he himself lived in extreme personal poverty, nothing was too good or too precious or too valuable when it came to the accoutrements necessary for the celebration of Mass. Francis then was not a rebel, but a genuine reformer who reformed from within the church, a reformation rooted first in himself and in his own life, and then within the wider context of reform initiated and promoted by the church itself. But he was an original, a one-off, and never to be repeated and impossible to imitate singularity. A modern biographer of St. Francis remarks that Francis is more about being than doing. And like all interesting people, that is, like all real human beings, he was a mass of inconsistencies and seeming contradictions. But apart from his love of creation, he's known and remembered for his lifelong, unbending attachment to radical poverty. He frequently speaks of lady poverty. Poverty is therefore key to understanding the spirit of St. Francis. The first thing to say is that St. Francis's poverty was extreme, harsh, and uncompromising. It was not the ordered poverty of a well-run monastery or the romantic poverty of the bohemian dropout, but the precarious and vulnerable poverty of the really poor. He possessed literally nothing, and he wanted his brethren to possess absolutely nothing. So much so that he was positively incandescent if he saw the brethren acquiring things, anything at all. He wouldn't even let them possess personal prayer books at the beginning. And once, with his bare hands, he pulled down a simple dwelling they'd built for shelter during the winter. But even during his lifetime, Francis was conscious that his personal ideal of poverty was being diluted, if not betrayed. It's significant that after his death, it was precisely disagreements about poverty that provoked the most bitter divisions among the brethren. St. Francis saw how possessions, no matter how many or how few, have the power to possess us. And possession rapidly succumbs to possessiveness. And possessiveness sets us at a distance from one another, blinding us to God's providence and our essential dependence on him. But it isn't simply a question of ridding ourselves of possessions. Rather, it's the acquisitiveness that fuels our appetite for possessions and feeds our tendency to estimate ourselves and others according to status and success, worldly or otherwise. And even acquisitiveness is itself part of a deeper propensity to seek security in something, not necessarily possessions, that is less than God, in our self-image, for instance, or in our hard-won reputation, or our need to be in control, or always right. But St. Francis's compelling realization was that our ultimate happiness is served not by clinging to all these things, but by letting go of them. He was the master of the art of letting go. Most conspicuously, of course, he let go of material things, but he also let go of his reputation. People thought he was mad. He let go of his personal fastidiousness. He kissed the suppurating sores of the leper, and he let go of his pride and ambition by joining the ranks of the homeless and the destitute, by possessing quite literally nothing. He let go of all these things because he saw that they were an obstacle to what he really wanted above everything else. He let go of everything and anything that could be a distraction from loving God passionately in himself and in his creation. But what ultimately he let go of was an illusion. He insisted on absolute poverty because he saw through the illusion of ownership. He says in the early rule, there is nothing in this world we can claim as our own, except our sins. Because no matter how many things we possess, we don't actually own anything. We can't even count our lives our own. They're given to us and they're taken from us, which is why he says in the Rule of 1223 that the way of life of the Friars Minor is to observe the gospel by living sine proprio, without anything of one's own. But in letting go, St. Francis turned upside down the all too reasonable seeming values that we take for granted in our everyday lives. Where others saw security, he saw captivity. Where what for others was represented success was for him a source of strife. What for others were necessities were for him hindrances to love. But the essential point is to grasp that his letting go was a positive, not a negative. He demonstrated that letting go may leave you empty-handed, but clinging on to anything you can lay your hands on leaves you empty-hearted. But ultimately, even St. Francis's poverty is secondary. His holiness isn't defined by material poverty as such, but by what motivated it, namely his passionate love for God in himself and in his creation. But he found God most explicitly in the humanity of Christ and in the sacrament of the Holy Eucharist. The humanity of Christ, along with an emphasis on the concrete historicity of the gospel events, is central to Francis's faith. It had become prominent before him in the writings, for instance, of St. Anselm and among the 12th century Cistercians, but it reached a climax in St. Francis and indeed would go on to influence future generations, including St. Ignatius in his spiritual exercises. Francis made his keen sense of Christ's humanity and the events of the gospel explicit in acting them out or performing them. At Great Show, for instance, he was the first to depict the birth of Christ in the stable, giving rise to the crib, ubiquitous now at Christmas. He took literally Jesus's injunctions in the Sermon on the Mount, and especially in the Beatitudes, acting them out, as it were, in his absolute poverty. And it was this emphasis on the humanity of Christ that led him to revere the Eucharist, the corporal presence of God incarnate in the person of Christ. He stressed that the presence of Christ in the consecrated elements is the only visible corporal encounter with the Redeemer that is possible in this world. And he saw manifest in the Eucharist, as he did in the Incarnation, the humility of God, who deigned to dwell among us in a corporal manner. He says in his letter to the whole order, "I implore all the brothers to show all possible reverence and honor to the most holy body and blood of our Lord Jesus Christ, in whom that which is in heaven and on earth has been brought to peace and reconciled to Almighty God." And in the same letter, shortly before his death, he writes, "Let everyone be struck with fear when Christ, the Son of the living God, is present on the altar in the hands of the priest." Again, in turn, it was precisely his reverence for the Eucharist, the sacramental presence of Christ in the form of food and drink, that both gave edge to his sense of the goodness of the material creation, and that grounded his sense of the brotherhood or community of all God's creatures. Notice his understanding of community stretches far beyond the conventional community format of institutional religious life. Community is given to us with creation itself, and therefore has no bounds. But it's also something that we create in myriad different ways when we acknowledge the community of all creation. And nowhere is that sense of the community of creation better expressed than in his Canticle of the Creatures. Far from being nature worship or an expression of romanticist sensibility alone, his love for and celebration of creation and his sense that other creatures are our siblings is rooted in his love of the Creator. Canticle of the Creatures was composed during a time of great physical suffering. And it speaks of creatures not as objects, but subjects, gendered subjects even. The sun, the wind, and fire are our brothers. The moon, the stars, water, the earth, and even death are our sisters. And God delights in everything he has brought into existence for its beauty and its usefulness. Francis even implies that non-human creatures do a better job of praising their creator than we humans do, since we are all too prone to abuse creation and forget that it is a gift to be nurtured. We, he thinks, can learn from other creatures, especially from their humility. The last invocation of the canticle is significant. Praise and bless my Lord, and give him thanks, and serve him with great humility. Let me just read very briefly, because it is only brief, the canticle of the creatures. Most high, all-powerful, good Lord, yours are the praises, the glory, honor, and all blessing. To you alone, most high, do they belong, and no human is worthy to mention your name. Praised be you, my Lord, with all your creatures, especially Sir Brother Sun, who is the day and through whom you give us light. Blessed are, he is beautiful and radiant with great splendor and bears a likeness of you, most high one. Praised be you, my Lord, through sister moon and the stars. In heaven you formed them clear and precious and beautiful. Praised be you, my Lord, through brother wind, and through the air, cloudy and serene, and every kind of weather, through whom you give sustenance to your creatures. Praised be you, my Lord, through sister water, useful, humble, precious, and chaste. Praised be you, my Lord, through brother fire, through whom you light the night, beautiful and playful, robust and strong. Praised be you, my Lord, through our sister Mother Earth, who sustains and governs, who produces various fruits with colored flowers and herbs. Praised be you, my Lord, through those who give pardon for your love and bear infirmity and tribulation. Blessed are those who endure in peace by you, for by you, Most High, they shall be crowned. And praised be you, my Lord, through our sister bodily death, from whom no one living can escape. Woe to those who die in mortal sin. Blessed are those whom death will find in your most holy will, for the second death shall do them no harm. Praise and bless my Lord, and give him thanks, and serve him with great humility. Now, you'll have noticed that I haven't mentioned another person, or a person who played a huge role in the life of St. Francis, namely St. Clare. She was inspired by what she had seen. She herself was a member of an aristocratic family, the Offreduccio, in Assisi, and she did the unthinkable on Palm Sunday in 1209. She left the confines of the home and wandered down to the Porziuncola in the plain of Assisi and asked to join Francis. She was 18 years old, he was 28. Eventually, and of course, at the time he did the unthinkable, he cut off her golden tresses, which are still preserved in Assisi, as a symbol of her joining the group that he had founded. Of course, that was an absolutely impossible option for women of her status, and at that time, they could only exist in the home or in a convent. But eventually, with Francis's help, she would form her own group of like-minded women, one of them her own sister, Agnes, who was set up by Francis in the small convent of San Damiano, outside Assisi, as contemplatives, the only possibility for women religious in the 13th century. She herself would outlive Francis by 25 years. The sources say very little about her, though she herself makes frequent reference to Francis in her own writings. But we know for certain that throughout their lives, they were in close contact and were the closest of friends. It was her whom he consulted when he couldn't decide whether or not to live as a hermit. It was near San Damiano that he spent a large part of his last days of illness. It was to her that the brethren took his body immediately after his death. Theirs was, without any doubt, a faithful and fruitful friendship, one of the great friendships between men and women with which the history of the Church is blessed. Now, I just want to conclude with a few more remarks and then another prayer from St. Francis. A recent author, writing about St. Francis, says, Assisi's little man in rags is the patron of passion. He is a holy pyromaniac, eager to set our hearts madly ablaze with love for God, for Christ, for all humanity, and for all creation. In the end, the legacy that St. Francis has left the whole world is the example of a life which few, if any, can ever hope to imitate, but which, if we're prepared to fall under its sway, can point us all like an unfailing compass towards that which really matters, towards the real purpose and goal of our lives, where alone we will find and know, as he did, joy, peace, and true lasting happiness. Where does that compass point? Well, let himself have the last word from the earlier of his two rules. Wherever we are, in every place, at every hour, at every time, every day, and continually, let all of us truly and humbly believe, hold in our heart, love, honor, adore, serve, praise, bless, glorify, exalt, magnify, and give thanks to the most high and supreme eternal God, Trinity and unity, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. To him who is creator of all, savior of all, without beginning or end, unchangeable, invisible, indescribable, ineffable, incomprehensible, unfathomable, blessed, praiseworthy, glorious, exalted, sublime, most high, gentle, lovable, delightful, and above all else, totally desirable, forever and ever. Amen. In well-ordered friaries, it used to always be the case that at the end of the reading of the rule on Fridays, the exhortation of St. Francis to the friars was read out, and the words in themselves sum up a great deal of what I've been saying. Here they are. Most beloved friars and sons forever blessed, hear me, hear the voice of your Father. Great things we have promised, greater have been promised us. Let us observe the former, let us aspire to the latter. Pleasure is short, punishment everlasting. Suffering is slight, glory infinite. Many are called, few are chosen. Brothers, while we have time, let us do good. I'm very conscious that that's not 40 minutes.
It's absolutely okay, Father Alban, because we do have some questions coming through. There's an interesting one come through, which is somebody who's saying that they're new to Catholicism, and they're asking the question, how can Pope Francis be both a Jesuit and classed as a Jesuit and a Franciscan, because they do call him a Franciscan Jesuit.
Yes.
Across the two sort of orders and live that out. What does that mean?
Well, he's not a Franciscan. I mean, a Franciscan is somebody who belongs to the order. He started life as a Jesuit. Now, it used technically under the old Code of Canon Law to be the case that if a member of one of the orders became a bishop or the Pope, he was no longer a member of the order which he originally belonged to. But the present code has changed that slightly in that he retains his membership of the order, and in this case, the Jesuits, but he's not any longer under obedience to the Jesuit hierarchy, as it were. So he's certainly not a Franciscan in the technical sense of belonging to the Franciscan order.
Okay, thank you for answering that, and thanks for the question. We've had another question in saying, how can Franciscan spirituality be applied to climate change?
Well, I mean, tellingly, St. Francis has become, I think, officially, insofar as these things are official, the patron saint of ecology. And I think that his attitude to the material creation is, in this age of ours, when we're particularly sensitive to degradation and abuse, exemplary. He, without any affectation or without any sense of ulterior motive, saw in every aspect of creation, creatures, inanimate objects, the forces of nature, absolutely everything without exception, the hand of God, and saw the whole of creation as one great family, one great brotherhood. Saint Bonaventure, the great 13th century theologian, who was part contemporary with St. Francis, well, when he was young, he writes about the vestigia Dei, the footsteps of God visible in the creation. So Francis, and remember when Pope Francis wrote his encyclical Laudato Si, that's a quotation from the prayer I've just read out, the Canticle of the Creatures, "Be praised, my Lord." He wrote it in the Umbrian dialect rather than in Latin. And in that document, Pope Francis specifically refers to St. Francis as the patron saint of ecology and the exemplar of the attitude we should, but also now recognize we need to adopt to the material creation.
Thank you for answering that. We've had a question in from Steve P. He's saying, how might Richard Raw's universal Christ chime in with Francis' holding of Jesus's humanity?
I think the two are not incompatible. I mean, Richard Raw, as a Franciscan, is very, keenly aware of, and I think would agree with everything I've said. I mean, remember, in Christ there are two natures, human and divine. So he is a human being, but he is also God incarnate. And so the idea of the universal Christ and the particularity of his humanity, which he still possesses, are both, they're completely compatible. They're not in any way contradictory.
Thank you for that. I've had a question from Nicholas, and it says, how accurate is the popular prayer of St. Francis that begins, "Lord, make me a channel of your peace," in summarizing Franciscan spirituality?
Well, that lovely prayer, which is very popular and we all know it, is thought not to be by St. Francis, but rather a 19th century French composition. But I'd have thought that there's nothing in there that's incompatible with the spirituality of St. Francis, with the spirit of St. Francis. And indeed, I think it embodies many of the attitudes he himself personally evinced towards those around him and towards the world. Bear in mind, when I said that Francis was a man of many inconsistencies, this man of huge gentleness and sensitivity could also be justifiably very angry. As I said, when he'd been away and came back and found they'd built a shelter, he tore it down with his own hands. He could be incandescent. I mean, there is such a thing as just anger. But though the prayer is full of wonderful, gentle sentiments, when you think that where that prayer has been spoken and rehearsed, remember Mrs. Thatcher quoted from it before she entered number 10 for the first time. That prayer is exquisite. I think it's a wonderful prayer that I think is a very, very good indicator of how we should be living our lives.
Thank you for that. I had a question from Peter. Could you comment on his visit to the Sultan?
Yeah, well, that was remarkable. That was absolutely remarkable. Remember, this is at the height of the crusading era. And again, one of the things that I should have mentioned was arising out of his sense of the community of all creation is, of course, his emphasis on peace and the avoidance of discord. And he genuinely saw, going to see the Sultan, he genuinely wanted to seize an opportunity in which it would be possible to explain what precisely we've been talking about. And of course, he was treated with great reverence by the Sultan in Dalmatia. He he was I think, given things which, of course, he gave back. But I think he was treated with great honor and reverence. And yes, I think that's a very, very vivid illustration of how these insights were also very practically shaping of his life.
Another question here, given that the Franciscans live a community life, does the rule of life as written by Francis in 1223 have any linkages with the rule of St. Benedict written centuries earlier?
Well, it's interesting. You see, the rule of 1223 is the official rule. He'd written another one in 1221 that didn't get papal approval. So to sort of get his mind, you've got to read the two together. The original collection of scriptural quotations we've lost. Now, the rule of 1223, of course, it's written for a stable community. But the stability of those early Franciscan communities were not the same as the stability of a Benedictine community. Remember, the change that happens in the 13th century when the mendicants, the orders of friars, come on the scene, is from the stable, self-supporting existence of the monastery, the kind of ecclesiastical counterpart of the castle outside the town. The move is away from that to friars, a new kind of religious, who are not limited to one particular place, who are not confined to one particular monastery. They do belong to provinces from very early on, but they come and go and can be moved around. And so the essential aspect of their notion of community is the association with their brethren rather than the place. But having said that, it's also interesting, St. Francis didn't spend much time in communities. I mean, I think that St. Francis was quite a lot on the road. And indeed, one of the great disagreements that took place in the very early days of the order concerned whether or not they should live in communities, in places, or whether they should be like St. Francis on the road. And those who chose to be on the road, as it were, as opposed to living in regulated communities, tended on the whole, they were called the spiritual Franciscans, tended, some of them anyway, they veered in the direction of heresy. But nevertheless, that's in one sense irrelevant to the point I'm making. It's the fact that this was a variant interpretation of the spirit of St. Francis. Do you live in a friary, or do you live on the road? Now, the fact of the matter is that once they begin to live in friaries, inevitably they attract endowments, they attract gifts. It's quite difficult to sustain a life of absolute poverty when people take pity on you and start giving you everything you haven't got, thinking you must need it. So there's a kind of contradiction built into the idea of total poverty. But I think also that one of the great splits in the order, and the one reason why the branch that I belong to are called conventuals, Order of Friars Minor Conventual. The word conventual refers to living in friaries. And they were the ones who accepted the papal direction at the time that they had to regularize their life. They had to organize themselves in ways that they were not just random individuals wandering, not aimlessly, quite the contrary, around the place, but they had to be regulated. And so eventually the order, as I said earlier, fragmented into various groups, or brought into three at the end of the 19th century by Leo XIII. So in other words, the kind of community envisaged by Benedict and Francis, they're quite different communities, both physically and in terms of the idea governing them. But they have in common, of course, that people live an interdependent existence, rooted in, of course, as with St. Benedict, the gospel.
Thank you for that. Another question, how frequently do Francis's canticles appear in the Franciscan liturgy?
Well, there isn't any longer a specifically Franciscan liturgy. There was seraphic liturgy, which wasn't that massively different before the Second Vatican Council. But it was only different in the sense of part of the ritual of the Mass particularly was slightly different. The Canticle of the Creatures would always be said on the Feast of St. Francis, recited, but as far as I know, it doesn't appear in any fixed place in the liturgy as such, because there isn't any it used to be called the Seraphic Liturgy.
Thank you. We've had a question asking a bit more about yourself. Just asking about how you live your life out as a Franciscan. What does your daily life look like?
Well, very much like your own, I imagine. Now, I'm a bit like St. Francis in that I haven't lived in a community for quite a long time, because the work I do has always required that I live where I'm working. But the community where I am, as they say, de familia, you have to be assigned to a friary, is the Oxford Friary, even though I live in Cambridge. But you know, the Franciscan, as I said, and this is not in any sense to sidestep this question, but taking for granted that nobody so far has imitated St. Francis utterly and perfectly, then there's a certain sense in which your life is informed by certain values, even if externally they or these values coexist with external circumstances that in no sense replicate the way the early friars themselves lived. So I think that the spirit of St. Francis is informed by insights and values, which are fundamentally the insights and values of the gospel made explicit. And those are the ones that, if you're a Franciscan, but also if you're any kind of Christian, those are the ones that inspire your life. Now, you know, how successfully those are allowed to inspire your life is the judgment of others, not me.
Thank you for answering that. Jill's asked, what kind of relationship is there between the Franciscans and the Poor Clares?
Interesting. So, you know, the whole order, if you think about the whole order as everybody who is officially a member of any Franciscan family, is divided into the first order, the second order, and the third order. And these terms came in very early on. The first order are the friars, the second order are the Poor Clares, and the third order consists of anybody and everybody, lay, clerical, prelatical, or anybody clerical, who can be a member of the third order. The third order is now called the secular Franciscan order. And if Francis had anything in his mind at the very beginning, I think that probably is most like the idea he had. So the second order are the nuns. Now, even the nuns, some of them are contemplative, some of them are not quite contemplative, but the ones who follow the original, again, they split up as well into various groups, but the original ones, for instance, if you go to Assisi, now they don't live in San Damiano, now they live in Santa Chiara, and there they live the fully contemplative life. You see them behind the grill. They like monks, pray the office throughout the day and night. Remarkable people. But all in these many different forms, these are all inspired by the same set of values that were St. Francis's.
Another question: war, wealth, inequality, and climate change. How would Franciscans work towards the protection and integrity of all creation?
I think the integrity of creation, of course, it's a big idea, so it really can only be realized primarily, or at least it must be realized on the level of you, the individual person. You know, it's simply a fact that we have to balance what we can do with what others on a different level altogether, on the level of nations and economies, also must do. And it can be sometimes quite discouraging to think, when you think of England or the United Kingdom, we're responsible for only 1% of all carbon emissions. And no matter what we do, it's not going to make the slightest bit of difference unless the United States, America, China, and India do something too. Now, of course, one shouldn't be discouraged, because if this arises not just out of need, but out of a consciousness of the integrity of creation, then there is, in a sense, every incentive to be respectful of creation, to see ourselves related to creation as a part, not over above it, even if in the bigger picture, the various problems attaching to natural degradation and climate change are not within our gift to affect.
Thank you very much. Well, I've gone through all the questions. It felt like a round of asking you questions, peppering you with lots of questions, but you answered them all beautifully. So thank you for that, Father Alban. I think you wanted to join us together in a prayer, didn't you? Which was just to sort of close this part of the talk.
I think I might have said that prayer. I'm afraid. I tell you what. Oh no. Can I risk something?
Absolutely.
This is a kind of supplement to the breviary, which a Franciscan supplement to the breviary, and it came out a long time ago in the 70s. But in it's got various prayers of St. Francis, but it's got something called a Franciscan prayer written by a lady called Enid Dinnis, and some people might regard this as rather mawkish, but I'm going to read it just in case. I think it's rather good. So should we end with this? When I am old and tutored by the grim experience of days, when I have proven men in their ways, do not let the dreamer die. When I have learned aside to toss the foolish things that wise men hate, lest littleness should hold me great, be mine the folly of the cross. When comes detachment's strength to me, let mine the weakness be that wept o'er Lazarus's grave and kept 3 comrades in Gethsemane. When head bids heart herself forget, when reason's lure would love deceive, may my poor foolish heart achieve a few life-giving blunders yet. And when I have grown too sane, too sad to join the angels' fairy ring and serve the playtime of the king, then, sweet Saint Francis, make me mad.
Lots of smiles along there I can see on the gallery of faces. So Jennifer particularly seemed to like that one. So thank you for that. I think if there's any more questions, does anybody want to ask Father Alban any more questions? I'd hate to denude you of this opportunity. Do just give yourselves a moment to have a think if there's anything else you'd like to ask.
There is a hand waving there.
I think Mary, is
Mary,
it Mary Wilkinson? Please just put your microphone off, unmute yourself, Mary, and ask your question.
The inevitable unmute.
Yes.
Surely, Father, it's not possible to live St. Francis's degree of such radical poverty in today's world.
Well, if we had time, I'd have said more on poverty, because if you think about it, it is impossible for everybody to live like that. Society would collapse. And so in a way, for somebody like St. Francis to exist, he requires the rest of us go out to work. And he requires an economy that sustains him. So in a certain sense, thank goodness it's limited to some very rare and few individuals. Nevertheless, I think they are beacons. They direct us, like this compass I was talking about, to remind us, just as, you know, if the whole world became members of the Franciscan order, the race would die out. So we don't want that to happen. So in a certain sense, you know, economic poverty is one thing. We're all economically poorer or richer than somebody else. But I think it's this spirit of poverty, which I think we're meant to take from the literal poverty of St. Francis. But you're quite right. You're quite right.
And how would the spirit of poverty pay out in today's world?
Well, again, I think I tried to say something about that. The illusion of ownership is, I think, the first redoubt that needs to be somehow dealt with. We do motor along in the illusion that we own things. We don't even own our lives. I mean, obviously we own them in the sense that we are responsible for them, but our life is given to us and our life is taken from us. And nothing is ours, and therefore everything is to be shared. You see, the very nature of gift implies that we share what we have, because those gifts were shared with us. If your perspective is that everything is a gift from God, then every gift is given to be shared, because it was shared with you in the first place.
Thank you.
Thank you for your question, Mary. We've had a request in just asking if you would be willing to share the paper that you've discussed tonight, and indeed the final prayer that you gave.
Sure, yes, I would.
So if anybody would like that, please just email me and I can send that onwards to you. I'd be happy to do that. Does anybody else want to unmute themselves and ask a question? Oh, Ian. Hello, Ian. Good evening. Yes, Ian.
Hello. I wondered if Father Alban could tell us about the interdenominational nature of Franciscans, because I know many third order Anglicans in Truro.
Yes. Well, I think it was in the 20s that I can't remember now the name of the person who founded this group, but the Society of St. Francis was founded in the 1920s and is still going strong. And I think their main house is in Dorset, isn't it?
That's right.
And they used to have a house here in Cambridge until relatively recently. And when I lived in Canterbury, they came to Canterbury, and I'm talking about the 70s now. Yes, and an impressive lot they are. And, you know, that was a great part of a great flourishing of religious orders in the Church of England that had, of course, been suppressed. And then through the Oxford movement, you know, came to life again. And I've not come into contact with them for a very long time, but I think they're still flourishing, and as far as any religious order is flourishing. But I think that, you know, the visit to the Sultan, that itself, St. Francis was an ecumenist, you know, a proto-ecumenist in going to speak to the Muslims. And I think ecumenism has been written into the Franciscan ethos. Our own Father Maximilian Kolbe went to Japan to dialogue with Buddhists there. So yes, I think it's one of the inspirations, and a great binder of people who might feel there's a great difference between them. To have that in common is, I think, you know, a great blessing.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ian, and lovely to see you on the call again. Any other questions for Father Alban? Just have a little look through the gallery. Wonderful. Well, on behalf of all of us, Father Alban, I'd just like to thank you so much for taking the time out to actually join us this evening and go through the Franciscan spirituality. It's been really illuminating for us. As you know, Father Alban does do some work for the tablet. So he is the religious books editor, and he does review that. So he is part of our tablet family and community, and it's always a joy to see him in the tablet offices. So hopefully we'll see you again soon.
Thank you, Amanda, and thank you to everybody, and thank you especially for the questions. Most interesting. Thanks.
Thank you. I'd just like to do for people that are used to coming to the tablet events, we do end off with just telling you what's ahead. There's an interesting one, actually, because we have a pilgrimage to Rome and Assisi. I don't want to embarrass Father Alban, but he is actually hosting this one. So it's an 8-day trip from Luton and Manchester, 4 nights in Rome and 3 in Assisi. And I think after this evening, you'll see he's an absolute expert on it. He'll be combining worship and sightseeing. The cost is there, and the booking deadline is Monday, the 15th of August. And we do run trips, and it's good to see now that we've got the Rome trip, the Holy Land trip, and various other ones. So please do look on the website, as we're loading things in all the time. And our partner with our trips is McCabe Pilgrimages. If you have missed any of the Tablet Summer School, please don't worry about that. We have recordings of all of the webinars. So if you've bought a season ticket, we'll just send you the recordings of the ones that you've missed. Or if you'd like to just replay them, then happy to send you the recordings. We do this via a thing called WeTransfer. It's really simple to use. And I say you get the full recording and you can watch it whenever you want. Our next event will be Wednesday the 27th as part of this series, when we're talking about Benedictine spirituality, and that's led by Abbot Mark Barrett. So that's on the 27th of July. Tomorrow, we have trauma, resilience and pastoral recovery. We've got Raymond Friel, Chief Executive Officer of Caritas, and Jim McManus, the Executive Director and Public Health of Hertfordshire County Council. That's the Pastoral Review webinar hosted by Dr. Natalie Watson, and that will be from 6 till 7 p.m. And then as we head off towards October, we're starting to pull in the September and October events. We've got 60 years after the opening of Vatican II. And we've got Thomas O'Loughlin, Dr. Alana Harris, and Dr. Patricia Kelly. So they'll be looking at what's happened over the last 60 years and looking forward. And the last thing is, if you're not a subscriber to the Pastoral Review or indeed the tablet, we do have various offers on currently, so please do keep an eye on the website at www.thetablet and the Pastoral Review, which is now part of the tablet website. Can I thank you, Father Alban, once again for your time this evening, and can I thank you all for joining us. Supporting our webinars we're so grateful to you from the tablet team. So on behalf of myself, Stephanie, who's produced this evening, and Father Alban, we'd just like to wish you a lovely evening. Many thanks.
Thank you, Baba. Can I have a word with you, Amanda?
Absolutely.